Pleasure to welcome you all here today to a gallery talk about our new special exhibition, which is called Roger Shimomura, By Looking Back, We Look Forward. So this is a show that we were lucky enough to be able to mount through the generosity of many people. So our museum owned, I believe, 1, 2, 3 Shimomura works before this started. Jordan Schnitzer himself, in his private collection, has a very large representation of his work, and so we were able to borrow from Jordan's collection. And in addition, because Shimomura's work is so timely and so, he's so prolific, we were able to actually work with Shimomura himself, the artist, and 2 of his gallerists, so Greg Kucera in Seattle and Sherry Leedy in Kansas City. And so we were able to present not just the things from our own and Jordan's collection, but some of his most recent works with the paint barely dry that I'm sad to say are still so relevant. So with that, I thought I would start talking a little bit about Roger Shimomura himself. Roger Shimomura was born in Seattle in 1939, and he is 3rd generation Japanese American. So within the Japanese American community, we talk about generations. Issei means 1st generation, those who came from Japan. Nisei, 2nd generation, those born here who are, of course, American citizens. And Sansei, and later Yonsei and Gosei, those who come thereafter. Shimomura's artwork is through the prism of his family's internment experience. And so when he was a small child in 1942, most of the Japanese people and people of Japanese descent who were American citizens along the West Coast were forcibly removed and put into concentration camps. Again, a little bit of nomenclature. Concentration camp sounds terrible, and it was bad, but there's a movement to talk about them as concentration camps because those are the terms that Roosevelt used. And that is, in fact, what they were. They were camps in which people were concentrated. They were not death camps. So I don't think anybody wants to win that particular contest. But the terms that we use now today are not so much internment camp, which was the official name at the time, but or relocation center, but concentration camps. And people were not just evacuated, but they were forcibly removed. So Shimomura was about 3 years old when his family moved first to one of the so-called, euphemistically called, civil assembly centers, which were generally places because the US government didn't have time to make facilities to house and feed 120,000 people. So they took a few months with people staying in fairgrounds and racetracks, often staying in the stalls that were intended for livestock. And so after a while at Camp Harmony, his family was relocated along with many from the Pacific Northwest to Minidoka, the Minidoka Relocation Center in Hunt, Idaho. And you will see in this exhibition a number of works that are his childhood recollections of that, and then other works that are kind of more rococo in the sense that they're not documentary, but kind of riffing off of the theme of that internment experience. So we should talk a little bit about Shimomura's style, which is very interesting. He is a pop artist, and after spending a year and a half in the internment camp, his family was relocated to Chicago, finally came back to Seattle. He finished his schooling there. He wanted to become a graphic artist, as were a number of his relatives. His parents did not want him to become a graphic artist. They wanted him to go into medicine. And failing that, they would like for him to go, or they wanted him to go into the military. And we'll talk a little bit more about Japanese American veterans, but they actually got a decorated veteran from the 442nd to come and basically give him a pep talk, and he ended up in the ROTC for a certain amount of time. He served about 2 years in the Army, was stationed in the US and then in South Korea, and then eventually went back to school at University of Washington in Seattle, and then on to Syracuse, where he studied art, particularly painting and performance, and specialized in pop art. At that moment, in the late 1960s, pop art was all the rage in New York, And when we talk about pop art, we are, of course, talking about a movement that grew up largely in response to abstract expressionism, which was all about how the picture surface looked and the process, and not so much about the imagery or the iconography, whereas pop art was taking ostensibly banal iconography, comic books, Hollywood stars, objects that you would buy in the supermarket, and lifting those up to the point of high art, with a great deal of controversy and humor involved. Shimomura came to realize that pop art was characterized as being cool and detached, and he sought to make it hot and relevant. And what you'll see is a kind of cartoony style in the sense that you have flat colors, the way that you would see, for example, in a comic. And you'll see some iconic images. So you'll see he does direct quotations from, for example, Andy Warhol's images of Marilyn Monroe, and the idea of taking objects that you would buy in the grocery store. In this case, he's juxtaposing crackers that I think are supposed to remind you of Ritz crackers with Maruchan ramen. So kind of playing at what is American, what is Japanese. But the interesting thing that happened with Shimomura's art is that he started thinking about what other pop imagery he could mine, he could appropriate in order to create his own art. And I must say, studying Roger Shimomura has made me realize what a privileged and comfortable existence I have lived. He has just had one terrible discriminatory experience after another. And that kind of inflamed him, and he's channeled his outrage and his despair into artwork that is funny and pointed. And you'll see lots of hybridization that happens in his art. So in this exhibition, we started with one wall that kind of references pop art and shows him not only going to standard American artists like Roy Lichtenstein and Andy Warhol, but actually looking at Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints of the Edo period and thereafter. So in Japan, ukiyo-e prints, those are prints of the so-called floating world, the world of kabuki actors and courtesans in the brothel district, of sumo wrestlers, is an urban, sort of fantastical environment of glamour. And those essentially were the pop art images of the Edo period. And Shimomura, who was profiled for his entire life because he has a foreign face, even though he is an American citizen, deftly thought to appropriate that type of imagery and to blend it with pop art, American style, in order to create something unique and quite political. So there are a couple of images here, and please follow me. I know it's very difficult to see and hear. Do you mind if we move this? I feel like I'm shouting into my own ear. It's very weird. So we do have images of Marilyn Monroe, as you would expect, a la Andy Warhol. But then we also have images where he has taken some of the common tropes of ukiyo-e. Those are images of beautiful women. And during the Edo period, it was thought that the back of a woman's neck was particularly alluring. So one conceit that you see in Japanese woodblock prints of the period is the woman seen from the back, but looking into a mirror, so you get a twofer. You get to see her face as well. Obviously, what Shimomura has done here are witty juxtapositions in which you have the back of a beauty, a la Kitagawa Utamaro's late 18th, early 19th century prints. However, looking in the mirror, you're seeing Elizabeth Taylor and Marilyn Monroe. So quite funny. This is kind of a mashup of images. This is called Over the Rainbow. And he's taken imagery from images of samurai, of sort of California pop, of courtesans from the brothel district, of Superman from a John Byrne cartoon, and of rice cookers. So he's got this funny mishmash of things all together. One of the interesting things about Shimomura's work is it's often difficult to tell what is a painting and what is a print, because he has this very uniform surface. And before the show arrived here, it was very difficult for the staff of the museum looking at the photographs because everything kind of looks like a print. But if you look carefully at his paintings, you realize he's taken pains to obscure any brushstrokes. There is no impasto. And it makes, as one of my colleagues has said, an almost chilling sense, the fact that he's kind of obscured his hand in such a way is quite an aesthetic feat and quite a technical feat. But I think as you look at the imagery and you start to unpack the imagery, you'll see that it is quite pointed. When we were standing in front of the introductory wall, there was an image of Shimomura as a young boy with his mother. And this is a painting that we were able to borrow from Shimomura and the Greg Kucera Gallery, and I'm happy to announce we have just acquired it for the museum. It will be part of the permanent collection. So one of the interesting things that he does with his imagery, especially the images that are documentary, the memory images from the internment, are the use of silhouettes. So as you can see a full-on image of his mother sweeping inside of their barrack in Minidoka. But Shimomura himself, as a toddler, is just a silhouette standing, holding a baseball bat. And that kind of obscures any sense of his emotional state. It also leaves that as a cipher. And as many people have pointed out, it also kind of references the terrifying images many of us have seen of the shadows that were left after the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's a multi-layered image. And one of the really hard things about talking about Shimomura's art is that it looks so simple. And like so many genius artists, it looks self-evident. You look at it and just think, well, it couldn't be any other way. And I think if I sat down to try and draw anything of this sort, I would never get to that kind of brilliant, balanced composition. So there's a great deal of art that he somehow effaces in a way that you just don't even really experience it. As we proceed along in this direction, if we'll just walk straight ahead over there, we'll be talking about a number of things that surround us on these walls. Shimomura has done a number of printed suites, and so we'll focus on two of them first. This is a three-part suite called the Nisei Trilogy. And Nisei, again, is the word for second-generation Japanese, people born in Japan. And this was a collaboration he did with a poet, in which the poet obviously has provided the text and he provided imagery. And for those of you who are conversant with, for example, Lichtenstein's imagery, you'll recognize that this is a direct quotation from Roy Lichtenstein images of explosions from comic books. And for those of you who aren't, Jordan Schnitzer was kind enough to lend us a fabulous Lichtenstein of an explosion, which we have at the far other end of the gallery. So there's like one place right here where you can see both, but you'll just have to trust me for the time being. The second image, again, has the silhouette of a child, and he puts himself in many of these pictures either as the little boy with the baseball bat or the little boy on the tricycle. And as you can see as you work across the surfaces, the first one is pre-war, just when Pearl Harbor is bombed. Pearl Harbor strips American citizenship, quote, non-aliens of Japanese ancestry, end quote, corralled. The second, our American eyes, aslant like kamikaze, blink in disbelief as barbed wire encircles and machine guns take aim. Obviously, the barbed wire is everywhere throughout the exhibition, and we ended up using it as a theme in the exhibition. I dare say this is the first time the Art Museum has ever procured barbed wire for any exhibition that we've done, but it seemed a direct output from his point. I think he wants people to put themselves, to empathize, to think about what it is to be profiled, to have no choice. The fact that not only you, but your parents were American citizens, and yet this completely unconstitutional thing happened to you. I think he very effectively makes that case through some of these seemingly simplistic works of art. This image, this post-war, Japs Not Wanted, is actually taken from a very famous pre-war photograph that was taken in Hollywood during a campaign that was called Keep Hollywood White in the 1920s. So the backstory for, well, the entire exhibition and for previous American history is there's a long-standing discrimination against many different people, and in this particular case, people of Asian descent. Starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first act directed against any specific ethnicity or nationality of people. It ended up expanding in the early 19-teens and the 1920s. And this is part of the reason that there are such strict generations of Japanese Americans. If it were otherwise, if Japanese could come at any time, you would have people of all different generations at different moments. But because of the exclusionary laws, the Issei are generally all of around the same age, the Nisei mostly are of the same age, the Sansei likewise. So Shimomura is a very young Sansei, third generation. Anyway, the image that has a woman just standing there proudly pointing at this gigantic sign on her porch saying "Japs not wanted" is just one of many historic images that show how the Japanese along the West Coast, who came to replace the Chinese who had been excluded in 1982, were systematically discriminated against. And in fact, it's part of a much larger sort of ethnic movement that was going on in the area. And in fact, the Japanese ended up suffering in large part because many of them turned out to be very able farmers. And they ended up running farms that, despite the fact that they were given terrible plots of land, they were able to make quite productive. And so when Pearl Harbor was bombed on September 7th, 1941, there was already a movement afoot that didn't want these people there, and that was the perfect pretext in which to get rid of these unwanted neighbors. And so it's so like Shimomura to take something so ugly and difficult to look at and make it into this kind of cheeky wartime pin-up girl aesthetic. The original photo doesn't look anything like that. She's not a very nice looking woman, but the juxtaposition of these two is quite jarring. It also shows that he's a very sophisticated user of early images, but he's not necessarily using them in exactly the way you might expect. As I mentioned, this is from the 1920s, the original image, but he's obviously using it to represent the post-war period. And that heartbreaking text, "We beg Mom for yellow slices of cheese between white bread or peanut butter and jelly for school lunches." The idea of being ostracized, what people called lunch shaming, coming to school with rice instead of a sandwich. Things we laugh about now because we're so much more open-minded and global in all of our decisions, but at the time, not so much. The other fabulous suite of prints that we have here is called Mistaken Identities. And each of these is taken from a specific historic image that Shimomura is referencing. So you'll see that the suite is called Mistaken Identities, but working across the top and then the bottom, the first one is for Tokyo Uemura, the second one is for Ansel Adams, the one at the lower left is for Seattle PI, and the one at the lower right is for Dorothea Lange. And you'll see on the label we've given you tiny images showing what his reference was to. I would just say that Tokyo Uemura was a Japanese-American artist who was sent to a different internment camp, and he did a beautiful watercolor of his wife, Suye, sitting in the door to their barrack and writing a letter. And obviously what Shimomura has done with this series is that he has reimagined these with figures from ukiyo-e woodblock prints, which to our eyes is, of course, charming and a kind of witty rendition. But in fact, there's a darker undertone to this because part of his message is these were American citizens, and they were treated as if they came from someplace else. So even, there's that tension between the beauty of it and kind of the terrible idea. In the center, the large face of the man facing towards the left, Ansel Adams is my new hero. Ansel Adams, like Dorothea Lange, traveled around and went famously to Manzanar, took a number of photographs, and he self-published a book called Born Free and Equal. He published it during World War II, and he was vilified for this. The book was burnt. I actually have a facsimile that I can pass around. It's a wonderful book. It's not just his photos, but it also has his text talking about how this is unconstitutional and it's outrageous. And it has beautiful images of Japanese and Japanese Americans as individual human beings, not just as a group of nameless people or a statistic. And so I think that image references a particular portrait at the end of the book of an individual. But I love the fact that he dedicated it to Ansel Adams. The lower right and lower left images both speak to images of the so-called evacuation. So images, one of the first photos that was published of a Japanese-American family that was being sent away was from Bainbridge Island. And there's a poignant picture of a mother carrying her sleeping child, and the child is, of course, wearing a tag as if she's luggage, as everyone had to be numbered in order to make sure that they got to the right place together. And so he has repurposed a Kitagawa Utamaro image of a mother and child, and really the only thing that shows you that this is not, in fact, a reworking of ukiyo-e is that tag. Likewise, on the lower left, there's an image of a young girl wearing a kimono that is derived from Dorothea Lange images of the Mochida family who were being evacuated, I believe, from San Francisco. And those children were all wearing Western clothing, but once again, it's superimposing a sort of Japanese foreignness on these figures. So powerful images, unexpectedly deep and resonant images. He's a master at finding a way to reference something and leaving it a little bit obscure, but not so much so that you can't find it. And rather than doing a blow-by-blow of every single work of art in the exhibition, if you do a little bit of reading about this field, you will find, oh my God, that's what he's talking about, and it's ever more powerful. I would point to this small square painting from a more recent series that he's done, which is a mashup. So he was very much influenced by another pop artist, an artist named Tom Wesselman. Shimomura's wife gave him a book of Tom Wesselman's Great American Nude series. And Shimomura writes about how he realized that Wesselman was using tropes, sort of a woman, a pot, a kitchen, a this, a that. And he thought, you know, I have images that I go back to over and over again. And he started doing these things. It's kind of like jazz. It's like jazz riffs. He mixes this with that. So what you're seeing here is an interior view from a barrack. So you're seeing the plain wooden walls, and what you're seeing at the upper right is the window, and you can see the tar paper barracks that are outside. And there's this beautiful iris, which is kind of not there in Minidoka, but references traditional Japanese paintings, particularly the Rimpa school. At the lower left, there's a very famous image that's of Roy Lichtenstein. First he did it as a huge banner, and then he did it as posters. It's called Pistol. That has a very different meaning when you're inside of an internment camp with guards with guns pointing at you. So again, this very dark humor. And at the top, you have something that you could buy in a grocery store, Hunt's tomato ketchup, which I haven't asked him, but I think that's because he was in Hunt, Idaho. So there are just all of these funny, punny, dark ways that he plays at this experience. There are two images here, one of him as a small boy with his mother at the top, and one of him, again, as a toddler with his grandmother. And his grandmother figures very large in his life. When he was born in Seattle, he was the last child that his grandmother delivered. And he has her diary that runs across the time, her time in the United States and through the internment, which he used as the basis for a number of performance pieces that he did. So, you know, these loving images, they look just like the images that you would see from anyone's childhood, except for the barbed wire. This is from a small suite of images that are Minidoka Snapshots. And again, very great economy of line, what he's able to do, but it's, you know, the same things over and over. That barren landscape, the barbed wire, the tar paper, and in this case, the guard tower. When you look carefully at Shimomura's titles, again, they seem very simple, but often freighted. So this one called American Soldier. So this is an opportunity to think a little bit about the 100th 442nd Regiment, combat regiment. So I believe still today the single most decorated military regiment in American history. So one of the things that happened during the internment was at a certain point, because Japanese were suspected, they were not allowed to serve in the military. And then there was a thought that everyone should be able to serve in the military. So they distributed loyalty questionnaires that people could fill out. And there were two particular questions in the loyalty questionnaire, I believe question 27 and 28. Question 27 was, would you agree to serve the American military wherever you are sent? And question 28, it's a trick question. Here you are, your family's incarcerated, your rights are taken away. Would you serve? People were frightened to say yes because they thought they were volunteering for the military. Question 28 was, do you forswear any allegiance to the Japanese emperor and swear allegiance to the United States? Again, that's one of those like, have you stopped beating your wife type questions. If you say yes, then it says that you were pledging allegiance to the Japanese emperor. So kind of impossible situation. This questionnaire tore families apart. And the people who answered no and no to questions 27 and 28 were ultimately deemed to be bad seeds, and they were further incarcerated. They made Tule Lake in Northern California into the high security camp, and its numbers ballooned from about 10,000 to about 33,000 people. And they actually started proceedings to deport those people to Japan. So American citizens born in America don't necessarily speak much Japanese, and you can imagine how much Japan would love to have you at that point. So now there were children of Japanese who were technically American citizens who had been educated in Japan, the so-called kibe, and those people were especially suspected, as were many civic leaders within communities. So a work of art like this that says American soldier is tipping the hat to the fact that there were 33,000 Nisei who volunteered to serve. And they served under extreme duress. They were essentially cannon fodder. They were sent to terrible missions with huge casualties. And so it is a mark of pride within the community, although it is still a tumultuous thing for anyone to think about what these people went through. One of the great ironies is there were Japanese Americans from Hawaii who were serving along with Japanese Americans from the West Coast. And there was a great cultural divide there. And in Hawaii, the Japanese population was about 150,000 at the time of the start of the war. And of course, they were there in Pearl Harbor. However, they were such a large part of the population in Hawaii that they couldn't be incarcerated because the economy would fail, and they actually needed their labor in order to rebuild and make sure everything at Pearl Harbor was able to get back to more or less regular service. So only major leaders there were incarcerated, and many of the Hawaiian Japanese Americans volunteered to serve in the military and then failed entirely to get along with the West Coast Japanese Americans whose families were incarcerated. And there was a difference in language because of sort of Hawaiian pidgin cultural differences. And there was also this perception on the part of the Hawaiian Japanese that the West Coast people were all very solitary, not sort of community-oriented. And in fact, one of the smart things that their military leaders did was they took a number of the Hawaiian Japanese to an internment camp, at which point there was complete solidarity because they could not believe that people would volunteer to serve when their families were being treated in that way. We'll talk about it later on, but there's all sorts of jargon that I ended up having to learn for this. I did not know the difference between a Buddha head or a Bula head and a katonk. So apparently in Hawaii, Japanese Americans called themselves and then were called by others, both in a positive and later in a very negative way, Buddha heads. Whereas they called the West Coast, or non-Hawaiian Japanese Americans, katonks, which is apparently the sound that a hollow coconut makes when it hits the ground. But their cultural differences notwithstanding, they fought valiantly. And one of the things that Shimomura really questions in this show is what is patriotism and who is American. So a title like American Guardian, American Soldier is quite pointed, even though it seems quite simple. We sort of segue from the documentary to the slightly more rococo images here, in that you have something going on that is more cartoony. And one of the things that we'll see a little bit later on in the exhibition is Shimomura's interest, which I think actually comes out of ukiyo-e woodblock prints, in the partially obscured view. And you'll see that in a lot of these images where there are people in front and barbed wire, but looking into barracks in which shades are drawn and you can only see some of what's going on inside. But you know, his imagery of, for a change, because during World War II there were of course egregious and perhaps understandable but still egregious stereotypes of what Japanese look like. So to show a Japanese soldier as someone who was kind of in full color and a sort of sympathetic portrait, as opposed to this very cartoony version of an American soldier running by, this is called Riot. We move into two of the images that I find most troubling in the show. So Shimomura, again, has mined Japanese art history in the same way that he was looking at earlier ukiyo-e. He looked at even earlier Japanese paintings, and there's a particular type of landscape painting that in the field is called rakuchu rakugaizu. So these are images of scenes in and around Kyoto, the capital city, the historic capital. And in fact, this folding screen, the 6-panel folding screen that you see on the label here is in fact just beyond that wall. So you can see a great historic example of such imagery. Those screens are characterized by bird's eye views showing the landmarks of the capital and all of the happy people. And what Shimomura has done with one deft addition, that being the addition of the silhouette of the soldier standing on top of the guard tower with the gun pointing down at the camp, is he's taken something beautiful and celebratory and made it into something ominous and denoting surveillance. And again, he says that friends have characterized him as like a terrier with a bone, somebody who just refuses to let go, somebody whose entire artwork is like a stick in the eye. Don't forget, don't forget. So he is not subtle. The guard at the tower has the gun pointing at the little boy on the bicycle. And I was mentioning to people beforehand that part of the reason that I was particularly moved to do the show was not just a lifelong admiration for Roger Shimomura's work, but was because many years ago in the same gallery when we had a show from Jordan Schnitzer's collection, I had remarked to him, oh, I love Shimomura's work, especially those works with the guards on the tower. And he said, really? Because there's a gallerist who has one right now. Should I get it? And I thought, wow, sure, that would be great. So he called the gallerist, who unfortunately was overseas and sound asleep, and said he would buy this. So I'm particularly thrilled to be able to present this. This is obviously another work that is taking that theme of the rakuchu rakugaizu and has fleshed it out in a different way, in that, again, the people on the tower are largely faceless and anonymous, whereas the people beneath, even though you can't really see their faces, you can see that they are differentiated in terms of age, clothing, you know, by extension, their profession. You can see doctors, you can see people who are in the military, and again, that little boy on his tricycle in between barracks. So I was very grateful to have this as a centerpiece for the exhibition. He's an almost evil genius, his ability to take something so beautiful, that idea of the bird's eye view, and twist it into something. As a Japanese art historian, it kind of breaks my heart for him to be able to do that so effectively. He's kind of a master. But as we continue on along this wall, you'll see his playing with other iconic images and tropes. So this is again from the Great American Muse series, and he is a Golden Age comic collector. He cares deeply about all of the cartoons and toys that were there when he was a child. And so, you know, having the beloved Disney characters outside of the barbed wire looking in. Again, I think the potato here is again because he was in Idaho. So even as he's kind of making me cry, he also is making me laugh. The dark humor about his work is amazing. This one too. We all love Rosie the Riveter. This is obviously not a documentary image of what was going on during the internment. This is when he's starting to turn towards more recent activities. This is from 2018. And you'll see there are the more recent series along those walls that directly reference his concern about the way women are treated, about the way Muslims are being treated, about the way that people at the Mexican border are being treated. Again, profiling those concerns. But it's so like him to take something we all think of as positive, like, go girl, Rosie the Riveter. Oh no, she's outside the barbed wire. In fact, one of the earliest things that we have in the exhibition, which we've just welcomed into our collection, is this. This is a print from 1978 from his very tongue-in-cheek named series, 7 Views of a Japanese Restaurant. So for those of us who spent a lot of time looking at Japanese woodblock prints, many of the great series, especially of the 19th century, come in series. 53 Stages of the Tokaido, 36 Views of Mount Fuji. And I guess this is a moment in which to recount the fact that, as I mentioned, Roger has had a number of really negative experiences. And after graduating or getting his MFA at Syracuse, he went on to become a professor of art at the University of Kansas. And he unfortunately moved there at a time when people were unaccustomed to seeing a lot of Asian people around. And so he has all sorts of embarrassing, awful experiences. And he talks about going to, for example, an auction where he sat next to someone who was very proud and kept asking him, "Where are you from?" He said, "Well, I'm from Seattle." "Where are your parents from?" "They were from Hawaii." "I'm of Japanese descent." "Oh, I thought so. Do you do art with those Gishi girls?" Seriously. And he started doing his first print series, which was called very pointedly Oriental Masterpieces, using a word which would not have been condoned, especially by people in the Asian American community at that point. And people loved them. People actually remarked, "Great, finally your art looks like you." So you know, it's that difficulty of an artist. You want to do art that is attractive, that is relevant, that will sell, and yet you also, in his case, very pointedly want to get a political message across. And so I think that's part of the reason that he's gone from direct ukiyo-e imagery into things that are more documentary and speaking to his first-person experience, even if it's in a more roundabout way. This is a wonderful image in that it draws directly from a very famous image by an artist, Kitagawa Utamaro. This is a famous erotic album, and this is perhaps the most famous from that series. But in the original, you can see the entire languorous, odalisque-like back of the courtesan and the man who is in front of her, partly obscured by you. What Shimomura has done, and he's drawn this from other ukiyo-e imagery, is partially obscured the scene, which in a way insinuates that you're peeking where you shouldn't be looking. And it's a very effective means, and that's part of what I was referencing in the way that he's pulling down curtains and screens in a lot of his other images. So he's a very sophisticated master of playing with, he gives you just enough to identify what it's coming from, but the more you unpack his imagery, the more you have to think about, gosh, what is he telling me with this? I'm very proud to say that this large image belongs to the Art Museum, and this is yet another layer of his parody. So this is called Enter the Rice Cooker. And he is drawn directly from a very famous image by an Utagawa artist showing the actor Ichikawa Danjiro, I believe the 5th, marching up the Hanamichi stage during the kabuki play when he's supposed to save the day. So despite his scary face paint, he is the hero. And usually he's wearing armor and a fabulously huge sword. But in fact, what he's carrying here is, of course, a rice cooker. And you have him actually going this direction, and you have, again, an obscured view of a beautiful woman, but in this case, clearly not an Edo period courtesan from the brothel district, but a kind of wartime pinup who's applying lipstick, using her compact, and wearing her fabulous red gloves. So he loves playing around with these images. And he has used some of the same imagery in many of the works that he produces. I should mention, when I said he was a collector, he collects not only comics and memorabilia and toys, but he has a vast collection of disgusting, stereotype racist memorabilia from World War II, which he uses as the basis for a lot of the images that you see here. So we did not borrow a number of pieces like that. They're actually very hard to look at, but the playful way in which he layers things. So this image on the right shows somebody who I'm sure is supposed to be Hideki Tojo, a famous Japanese military figure, but he's got two Liechtenstein-like beauties on either arm, and he's got the classic reference, actually it was a Liechtenstein himself poking fun at abstract expressionists with their brush strokes by doing that type of brush stroke in a medium where obviously the brush doesn't normally do that. Likewise, Shimomura now has done these couples on the left. So the lower series is called Mix and Match, and here you have a sort of Liechtenstein-like conventionally beautiful, quote-unquote, American juxtaposed with, on the lower frame, opposite sex stereotypes of Japanese. And significantly, in a lot of Shimomura's work, the stereotypes of women from Japan are always alluring, and the stereotypes of men are almost always insulting and ridiculous, just horrible caricatures. However, the more that I have thought about that image, I realize that that Japanese woman is naked. And that sets up a power dynamic between her and the man that she is with that is also troubling in a different way. So really nobody gets off easy in Shimomura's work. He cares about a lot of different issues, so a number of his series include gay couples, and we are very happy that we were able to just welcome the frame above into our collection as well. As he looks through imagery about identity, both cultural identity and personal identity, again, he's playing at a lot of stereotypes. Here we saw Ichikawa Danjuro taken from the Utagawa school print there. Here we see Shimomura himself. He has inserted his own face, and he has become Ichikawa Danjuro, the hero who's rushing in to save the day. This is from a suite of two. This is its mate. This is Shimomura as Superman. And this is from the American knockoff series, Super Buddha Head. So when I first borrowed this, I didn't know what Buddha Head means, and now I do, and I think, oh no, he persists in making works of art with, he had a whole, I'm not even going to tell you the name of his show. He uses all sorts of grotesque words in a very direct way in order to point a finger and critique. This, again, from the Great American Muse series, we've seen Ichikawa Danjuro as the hero, we've seen Superman, obviously, as the hero. Wonder Woman, he's juxtaposed a 1970s Wonder Woman with his mother, and a little Korean animated female figure, Puka, flying through the air, but again with barracks, the samurai sword, and barbed wire. And perhaps the most iconic image in the show, this is from the American knockoff series in which he plays many different roles. So this is called American versus Japanese 3. And the more that you unpack this, the funnier and perhaps more expected it is. So obviously Shimomura in a white robe with his Superman costume on underneath, drawing the katana, the Japanese sword, but surrounded by all of these figures who are kabuki actors, samurai, sumo wrestlers, all armed to the teeth. And Professor Akiko Welly and I are team teaching a class, and it was really interesting listening to the professor and the students talk about, people always talk about Japanese art as being so flat. Well, when you look at the prints, they're not as flat as this. He's messing with you in all sorts of different ways. Likewise, he is not a martial artist, and he's even playing with that sort of hackneyed stereotype. Well, of course, if I'm an Asian man, I have to be a martial artist specialist. So again, there's a lot of play here, and I was so glad that Jordan had this painting. On the front wall of this other entrance, we have another self-portrait, which at the time we decided to put it on the cover of our members magazine. I didn't even fully understand the poignance of it. So this is a print that he did called Kansas Samurai. And in fact, again, it's a self-portrait. And it's taken directly from a very famous print by a Shin-hanga artist in the early part of the 20th century, Natori Shunsen. And it shows a kabuki actor playing a role of a samurai. And in the original, there's another sword that's just crossing with his, and it's on a very plain background. What Shimamoto has done is he's made it into a self-portrait. He's put his mustache and beard and glasses. But behind, which is what I had never really paid attention to, in the background you can see Dick Tracy, Superman, Dagwood, Popeye, Donald Duck, and Pluto, all in blue, all going the other direction. And in fact, he designed this just at the time he was retiring after 35 years teaching at the University of Kansas. And it really speaks to the isolation that he felt when he was there. Even at the time of the Iran hostage crisis, he was out jogging and he was run off the road by two rednecks in a pickup truck who started shouting epithets at him and screaming, "Take that, you and your Ayatollah, Chinaman." People so hateful and ignorant, they don't even know who they hate. So, again, it seems so sad to me that anyone has to experience that sort of ridiculous, racist experience. But for him to have over and over and over again done so and produce more and more pointed and angry art. When you watch interviews with him, when you talk with him, he's very placid. And it makes you wonder, well, how can he be so placid if he's so enervated about these things? I think this is why. I think that he must be able to express what he needs to in this, and probably that's very good. The last few things I thought we might focus on are on these walls. And in fact, we were very fortunate to be able to borrow a very, very sad document. So at the far left here is an actual poster that was displayed in Oregon, notifying the Japanese that they needed to convene in order to be taken away. And if you are close enough as I am, you can see that you're going to one of two civil control stations, one in Medford and one at 34 West 6th Avenue in Eugene. That is, of course, the spot where there is now the Japanese American Memorial, just between the Graduate Hotel and the Holt Center. And it's kind of an amazing thing to have something that makes this so pertinent and so real. Minidoka and Beyond is a series that Shimamoto has been working on, and this is just a small selection of many. And it's very interesting. Many of these are bounded in the past, and some of them it's taken a long time to unpack. I puzzled about this car for so long, but I realized there's a very famous photograph that was taken by Dorothea Lange on the day after Pearl Harbor was bombed. And it's of I believe it's called the Wanto store in Los Angeles, and it has a huge sign that says, "I am an American." And right in front of that store is this beautiful old car. So I think that this is that car, and that the license plate is 9066, which is the executive order number that Roosevelt signed that basically made the illegal legal and sent people to internment camp, of course, seen through barbed wire. Some of the other pointed images here, Andy, that's Andy Warhol, and Toyo Miyatake. So Toyo Miyatake was a Japanese-American photographer who was incarcerated in Minidoka. And he snuck, you weren't allowed to, but he did it anyway. He snuck a camera lens in with him, and he persuaded others there to help him make a box for his camera. And he was taking interior pictures inside of the camp. And he came to know Ansel Adams quite well, who came to take official pictures there. And later, the two of them ended up having exhibitions together. But I think that this is a juxtaposition of the relative freedom versus non-freedom. But obviously, Andy Warhol wouldn't have been in that age at that time. This is, again, his jazz-like riffing on the theme. This, a little bit hard to parse, but this is the hat of someone from the 442nd. And the patch is, ironically, the hands of the Statue of Liberty. Again, in internment camp with the barbed wire. This, American Patriot 2, speaking not to the Japanese American experience, but of the African Americans who fought valiantly and came back and were treated just as badly as ever. And he moves forward through the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the bombs, to something perhaps more pointed. That's Roger Shimomura himself. Again, when he was in the military, he was a young man. So this is, again, playing with time and place. But who's a patriot? Who's not? This is called Lieutenant. This is called September 11th. And this is the barracks eye view of perhaps the start of the next wave of profiling. Something that the Japanese American Citizens League in particular was extremely concerned about. Don't let this happen again. The last series are very small paintings. This is from the Muslims and More series. And I don't know how long it takes him to do these, but he seems to pop up with them over and over and over again. And again, riffing on more recent history, contemporary, immediate history, about his concern about the treatment, the Muslim ban, the treatment of women, the treatment of Muslims, the border, and playing with all of those tropes, the chilling, keep her out, tie her down, lock her out, silhouettes, imagery that really speaks to the present. Now that you can kind of unpack his imagery, even the things that are not obviously about a specific leader, it's, the hue and cry that terrible things are happening in this world. I think he manifests something that many of us do, that we have to be vigilant. We can't let this happen again. As I had mentioned, Jordan Schnitzer was kind enough to lend us prototype images. Imagine having a collection so vast that even if you have a pop art show that is traveling the country, you have some spare Warhols and Lichtensteins that work out for us. So we were able to borrow this fabulous diamond dust Warhol image of Superman to juxtapose with Shimomura's Superman, the Lichtenstein that I had mentioned of the explosion. We have our own teeny tiny Lichtenstein, which you can see over there, which is actually fingers pointing at you, which is kind of the cipher for the pistol that we saw at the other end. And I couldn't help myself, the I Love Liberty image by Roy Lichtenstein. In this area, we have a few traditional Japanese works from our collection, 4 fabulous woodblock prints, not just from us, but also lent by Lee Michaels, our local collector, very graciously, and that Rakuchu Rakugaizu screen that I had mentioned that is kind of the precursor to the imagery that Shimomura does with the guards on the tower. We've put a photograph here of the replica tower at Minidoka, and ended with an image that my colleague Akiko Wale had suggested, a beautiful Noda Tetsuo image that kind of speaks to that silhouette-like portrayal of Shimomura as a little boy. I have no reason to think that Shimomura was aware of Noda's particular image, nor that Noda was thinking about Shimomura. That's just curators doing what they do. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I thought I might just end by explaining why the show is called what it's called. The show title, by looking back, we look forward, is drawn directly from this. This is a yearbook for Minidoka. So as far as we know, this is the only one of the 10 internment camps that produced such a document. And I had no idea such a thing existed until a dear friend of mine gave it to me, saying that her uncle who had passed away thought that I might want it. And in it, do you mind? I'm just gonna hand you this, sorry, thank you. I just wanted to read the last paragraph of the dedication. May we dedicate this book to the, quote, land of the free and the home of the brave, where the Star-Spangled Banner shall wave in triumph. Sorry, I have to put glasses on because I can't read this without glasses. I'm not crying yet, so. Sorry. That's all right, I got it. Just need to be able to read. Where the Star-Spangled Banner shall wave in triumph, to a truly free and democratic America, where men shall be judged by their actions, not by their race, color, or creed, to our homeland and the homeland of our children, the United States of America. So we used this kind of as the guide to the exhibition. We put a complete facsimile of it, actually 2 copies in the center of the gallery, in an effort to make this a more human endeavor. It's easy to talk about statistics, but looking at photos of 45 barracks of hundreds of people, fathers, mothers, and children, makes it so much more real. And the fact that we're kind of doing this right now makes you think hard about when people say making America great again, what are they referring to? But the other book that we have in the center of the gallery is a wonderful graphic novel that was produced last year on the basis of George Takei of Star Trek fame's childhood experience at camp. This is a show that we want not just adults, but children to have a chance to think about and empathize with. And the fact that we have this show in this gallery and the powerful and really quite devastating Carrie Mae Weems show here that really speaks to the African-American experience today points to the fact that we are an academic art museum, and this is a place in which people should have difficult conversations as well as having an opportunity to see uplifting art. But I hope that you can see Shimomura's genius and that it gives you a chance to ruminate on the issues and think about how artists are incredible bellwethers. They're kind of sometimes the canary in the coal mine, or maybe they're just reiterating things that we all know but just need to be reminded. But I really appreciate the fact that he is capable of taking something so dark and making something that is enough of a puzzle and intriguing enough that it draws you to it, even if it stabs you in the heart when you get there. So thank you very much.